The morning Lady Eleanor Ashford decided to destroy her life. The sky over the Scottish Highlands was the color of a fresh bruise. She stood in the hallway of Thornwick Manor, her mother's shrill voice cutting through the walls like a blade. Another suitor was coming, the fourth this month. This one was different, her mother insisted. This one owned half of Edinburgh and had already buried 2 wives, which meant he knew how to be a proper husband. Eleanor felt her stomach turn. She was 23 years old, and she was running out of time. In her world, that meant she was running out of value. Her father had been dead for 18 months, and with him had gone any illusion that the Ashford family was anything more than a crumbling name attached to an empty bank account. The manor was mortgaged. The staff had been reduced to a cook and a housekeeper and a stable boy who was likely stealing oats. Her mother's solution was simple and surgical. Marry money. Marry it fast. Marry it before the creditors came knocking and the neighbors started whispering. Eleanor had watched 3 men parade through their drawing room in as many weeks. Men with soft hands and hard eyes. Men who looked at her the way her father used to look at his prized hunting dogs, evaluating her teeth and her temperament and her breeding potential. The last one, Lord Peaton, had actually asked her mother if Eleanor was good with children before bothering to speak to Eleanor herself. She had smiled politely through the entire ordeal, her face aching from the effort, while inside she screamed. That night, alone in her father's old study. Thus Eleanor made a decision that would have horrified every woman in her social circle. She was going to marry someone completely unsuitable, someone poor, someone so far beneath her station that her mother would have no choice but to leave her alone forever. She would ruin herself on purpose, and in doing so, she would finally be free. The plan was reckless and desperate, and possibly insane, but Eleanor had inherited her father's stubbornness along with his debts, and once the idea took root, she couldn't let it go. She spent 2 sleepless nights working out the details, pacing her bedroom until the floorboards creaked in protest. She would need to meet someone quickly, someone with no connections to her social world. A tradesman, perhaps, or a farmer, someone kind enough not to mistreat her, but poor enough to appall her mother into disowning her entirely. The universe, as it turned out, had different plans. On a frozen Thursday morning, Eleanor wrapped herself in her plainest cloak and slipped out of Thornwick Manor before sunrise. She told no one where she was going because no one would have let her go. The village of Brar was 3 mere down the rooted country road, far enough from the manor that she could move without being recognized immediately. She had been there only twice in her life, both times in her father's carriage, but she remembered it as a place where people worked with their hands and didn't care much about titles. The walk took longer than she expected. Her boots made for drawing rooms and garden strolls. Gates were not built for the frozen mud of a Highland road in February. By the time she reached the village, her feet were numb and her breath came out in clouds. The main street was quiet, just a few shopkeepers sweeping their storefronts and a farmer loading a wagon with hay bales. Eleanor stood at the edge of the square, suddenly unsure of what to do next. She had imagined this moment 100 times, but now that she was here, the absurdity of her plan hit her like cold water. What was she supposed to do? Walk up to a stranger and propose marriage? Ask the blacksmith if he was interested in a bankrupt aristocrat with no doughy and a mother who would curse his name for generations. She was about to turn back when she heard the sound of hooves on cobblestone. A man rode into the square on a mud-splattered horse, and his posture straight despite the obvious exhaustion in his shoulders. He wore the dark uniform of a British infantryman, though it was faded and patched in places, and his face was shadowed by several days' worth of beard. He dismounted in front of the inn, with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned not to trust solid ground. Eleanor found herself staring. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with the kind of face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. There was a scar along his jawline, pale and thin, and his hands, as he tied the reins to the post, were calloused and steady. He moved like a man who had seen things he would never speak about, and when he glanced up and caught her watching him, his eyes were the color of a winter sea. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Yet then, Eleanor did something she would never be able to fully explain, not even to herself. She stepped forward, her heart hammering so hard she thought he might hear it. And she spoke. "Excuse me, are you married?" The soldier blinked, clearly startled. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his jaw tightened as if he was bracing for an attack. He looked at her like she might be a hallucination brought on by too many nights sleeping on frozen ground. "I beg your pardon." Eleanor's hands were shaking inside her cloak, but her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I need to know if you're married. It's important." The man stared at her for a beat too long, his expression caught between confusion and suspicion. Then slowly he shook his head. "No, I'm not." Eleanor took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Good," she said, "because I have a proposition for you." The soldier didn't laugh, which Eleanor took as a small miracle. He stood there in the frozen square, one hand still resting on his horse's neck, studying her with the kind of careful attention men learned in war. His eyes moved from her face to her cloak, taking in the fine wool that she'd tried to hide beneath a layer of road dust. The way her posture gave away years of department lessons, even as she tried to seem ordinary. "A proposition," he repeated, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man who had heard too many propositions in his life. None of them good. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. This was madness. She knew it was madness. But turning back now would mean returning to Thornwick Manor, to her mother's plans, to Lord Peaton's tobacco-stained smile and the slow suffocation of a life chosen by someone else. "I need to marry someone," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Quickly. Someone who won't ask questions or expect anything beyond a legal arrangement. In return, I can offer you a modest sum. Not much, but enough to start over somewhere if that's what you need." The soldier's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He glanced past her, scanning the square as if checking for witnesses, or perhaps looking for whoever had put her up to this cruel joke. When he looked back at her, there was something harder in his face. "You're serious completely. You're running from something." It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Eleanor became aware of how loud her own heartbeat sounded in her ears. A cart rattled past behind them. Somewhere, a dog barked. The ordinary sounds of a village morning while she stood in the middle of it, asking a complete stranger to upend both their lives. "What's your name?" he asked finally. Eleanor hesitated. Giving him her real name meant risk, but lying seemed like a poor way to begin an arrangement built on mutual desperation. "Eleanor Ashford." She watched his face carefully for recognition, for the change that always came when people heard the Ashford name. But there was nothing. Either he didn't know the family, or he didn't care. Both possibilities felt like relief. "I'm James," he said. "James Mackenzie. And I think you should go home, Miss Ashford. Whatever you're running from, marriage to a soldier with nothing but a tired horse and borrowed time isn't going to solve it." The rejection stung more than Eleanor expected. She had prepared herself for suspicion, even mockery, but not for gentle dismissal, not for someone to look at her desperate plan and try to protect her from it. "You don't understand," she said, and hated how her voice wavered. "Going home isn't an option. My mother is determined to sell me to the highest bidder, and I won't do it. I won't spend my life as some old man's decorative investment. If I marry you, marry anyone she considers unsuitable. She'll wash her hands of me entirely. I'll be disowned, but I'll be free." James shifted his weight, and Eleanor saw him wassie slightly, some old injury making itself known. "And what happens to you after that? When you're disowned and married to a man with no prospects? Have you thought about what freedom costs when you can't afford bread?" "I've thought about it every night for 2 weeks," Eleanor said, and the honesty of it rang in the cold air between them. "I know what I'm asking. I know how it sounds, but I also know that if I don't do something now, I'll wake up one morning 20 years from now, in a house I hate, married to a man I despise, wondering when exactly I stopped being a person and became a thing to be managed." James studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor found herself unable to look away. There was something ancient in his eyes, yet the kind of weariness that had nothing to do with age. She wondered what he had seen in the war, what he had done, what he was trying to forget. "I can't give you the life you're used to," he said quietly. "I have a small cottage on the edge of nowhere. No servants, no society, barely enough to keep the roof from leaking." "That's not freedom, Miss Ashford. That's just a different kind of prison." "It's my choice of prison," Eleanor said. "That's the difference." Something flickered across James's face, then recognition, maybe respect. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and scars that marked years of hard living, and Eleanor saw him weighing something she couldn't name. "Why me?" he asked. "There are other men in this village, men who might jump at the chance to marry an Ashford, even a disgraced one." Eleanor had asked herself the same question in the 30 seconds since she'd first seen him. The truth was complicated and instinctual and impossible to explain. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he hadn't looked at her like a prize or a puzzle to solve, the exhaustion in his shoulders that matched the exhaustion in her chest. "Because you look like someone who understands what it means to want out," she said simply. James met her eyes, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was gone before Eleanor could be sure she'd seen it, but it left behind a warmth she felt in her frozen fingers. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we do it properly. Legal documents, witnesses, a real marriage in the eyes of the law, even if it's an empty one. I won't have you trapped in some arrangement you can't escape if things go wrong." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, something she hadn't realized had been clenched tight since her father died. "Agreed?" James held out his hand, rough and scarred and steady. Eleanor took it, and his grip was warm despite the cold. "Then I suppose we're getting married, Lady Eleanor." She smiled, really smiled for the first time in months. "Just Eleanor," she said. "I'm about to lose the title." Anyway, the wedding took place 3 days later, in a stone church so small it could barely hold a dozen people. Eleanor wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, borrowed from the innkeeper's wife, who had taken pity on her story, or at least the version of it Eleanor had carefully constructed. James stood beside her in his cleaned uniform at the patches less noticeable in the dim light, filtering through the stained glass windows. The priest, an elderly man with kind eyes and trembling hands, spoke the words that would bind them together, and Eleanor felt the strange weight of it settle over her shoulders like a cloak. When James slipped the ring onto her finger, a plain silver band he'd purchased from the village blacksmith, Eleanor noticed his hands weren't shaking at all. Hers were. They walked out of the church into afternoon sunlight that felt impossibly bright. Eleanor had written her mother a single letter delivered that morning, explaining in precise and unapologetic terms what she had done. She imagined her mother reading it over breakfast, the teacup shattering against the floor, the shrieking that would rattle the windows of Thornwick Manor. What the thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding her breath for years. James's cottage was exactly as he'd described it. Small, isolated, perched on a hillside overlooking a valley that stretched toward mountains still capped with snow. The roof didn't leak badly, just in one corner that James had marked with a bucket. There was a stone fireplace, a wooden table with two mismatched chairs, and a bed that James immediately insisted Eleanor take while he fashioned himself a pallet by the fire. "We had an agreement," he said when she protested. "A legal marriage, but not that kind. You keep the bed. I'll manage fine." Eleanor wanted to argue, but the exhaustion of the past few days caught up with her all at once, and she simply nodded. The first week passed in a strange, quiet rhythm, but James woke before dawn and worked on repairs to the cottage that Eleanor suspected he was inventing to stay busy. She learned to cook simple meals over the fire, burning more than she succeeded at first, but gradually finding a competence she'd never needed in her old life. They spoke politely to each other, like friendly strangers sharing a coach, never quite sure how much honesty the situation allowed. Eleanor found herself watching him when he didn't notice, the way he moved with purpose even in small tasks, the gentleness in his hands when he coaxed the fire back to life each morning, the nightmares that woke him gasping in the dark, though he always pretended he'd simply gotten up for water. It was on the 8th night, as they sat by the fire after supper, that Eleanor finally asked the question that had been building in her chest. "What are you running from, James?" He looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling, surprised. Then something resigned crossed his face, as if he'd been expecting this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. "The same thing you are," he said quietly. "Expectations. A life that was chosen for me, before I was old enough to have an opinion about it." Eleanor sat down her mending. "I don't understand." James was quiet for a long moment, the knife still in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like a man crossing a frozen river. "My full name is James Alexander Mackenzie, the Duke of Strathmore." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and absurd. Eleanor stared at him, waiting for the joke to land, but his face remained serious. "That's not funny," she said. "No," James agreed. "It's not." He told her the rest, then the words coming slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. He'd inherited the title at 19 when his father died. Suddenly responsible for estates and tenants and a position in society he'd never wanted. He'd fled into the army using a false name, desperate for something real, something that had nothing to do with bloodlines and expectations. The war had been brutal and clarifying, and when it ended, he couldn't bring himself to go back. So he'd stayed James Mackenzie, common soldier, living in a cottage on land he technically owned, hiding from a dukedom that was still waiting for him in a manor house 3 valleys away. "I saw you in that square," he said, meeting her eyes. "Desperate and brave and trying so hard to escape, and I recognized it. That look, I've seen it in my own mirror for years." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked tight since her father died. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed someone unsuitable," James said simply. "And I needed someone who wanted me for the wrong reasons, which somehow felt like the only honest reasons left." Eleanor started to laugh then, a sound that surprised them both. It built in her chest until tears streamed down her face. Matt and James was staring at her like she'd lost her mind, which only made her laugh harder. "We're both fools," she gasped finally. "I married a poor soldier to escape wealth, and you married an aristocrat to escape a title. We're absolutely mad." James smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Completely mad. Eleanor wiped her eyes, her breath still hitching with leftover laughter. "So, what do we do now?" James set down his whittling and moved to sit beside her on the hearth. He took her hand the same way he had in the village square, and his touch was warm and certain. "I think," he said slowly, "we stay here in this cottage, with the leaking roof and the uneven floor. We stay James and Eleanor, two people who chose each other for all the wrong reasons that somehow feel right. And maybe, if we're very lucky, we figure out what it means to build a life that's actually ours." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a duke or a soldier, but simply a man who understood what it meant to be trapped by other people's dreams. She thought about Thornwick Manor crumbling without her, about her mother's fury fading eventually into indifference, about the freedom that came not from wealth or titles, but from choosing your own prison and finding it wasn't a prison at all. "I'd like that," she said. James squeezed her hand. "So would I." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire crackled warm, and two people who had run from everything they were supposed to be sat together in the growing dark, discovering that sometimes the best marriages begin with honesty about how broken you both are. Its spring came early that year. Eleanor planted a garden. James fixed the roof properly, and in the small cottage on the hillside, a duke and a lady learned what it meant to simply be two people in love. Free at last. If Eleanor and James's story warmed your heart, I'd be so grateful for a like. Tell me in the comments what moment touched you. The first time the Duke of Ashford heard the bride was ugly. He laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was useful. It meant he could survive this marriage without wanting anything from it. It meant he could do what he had promised himself he would do years ago when he buried his father, and inherited a title full of pride and an estate full of debt. Feel nothing, need nothing, lose nothing. So when the morning of the wedding arrived and London rain turned the streets to mud, Alexander told himself the same thing again as his carriage rolled toward St. George's Church. This is business, not love. Yet his chest felt tight, as if his body already knew he was lying. Inside the church, the air was warm and heavy with candles. The guests sat in perfect rows, dressed in velvet and silk, pretending they came to celebrate, but their eyes were sharp. They came to watch the mighty Duke kneel to a merchant's coin. Alexander took his place at the altar. His best man, Lord Peyton, leaned close and spoke under his breath. "Still time to run." Alexander did not smile. "And leave my people to starve when the estate collapses." Peyton sighed. "You look like a man going to his own hanging." Alexander stared straight ahead. "I am because the truth was simple. His father had destroyed everything: gambling, drinking, borrowing, lying. By the time Alexander inherited the title, the Ashford fortune was already bleeding out. He had spent years selling land, paintings, horses, anything that could keep the roof from caving in. But it was not enough. The letters from creditors grew colder each month. The threats grew closer. Soon, men would come to Ashford Manor and take what generations had built. Then Augustus Hartley arrived with a solution. A merchant with a fortune so huge it made old lords swallow their pride. A man who wanted one thing money could not buy easily: a title. "You marry my daughter, Hartley said, calm as a banker, and your debts disappear. Alexander had wanted to refuse, not because he was noble, but because he hated being trapped. Yet he was trapped already. Refusing would not make him free. It would only make him ruined. So he asked the only question that mattered. Your daughter agrees. Hartley's mouth tightened just slightly. She understands duty. That was the first moment Alexander felt something strange. Not pity, not concern, just a tiny flicker of doubt. Because people whispered about Hartley's daughter. They said she was hidden away because her face was a tragedy. They said a childhood fire had ruined her. They said her father kept her from society because no man would look at her twice. Some said worse. London always did. Alexander had never met her. No portrait was offered. No visit was arranged. Her name on the contract was enough. Lady Eloise Hartley, the ugly maiden. And that was what made the bargain easier to swallow. If she was plain or worse, then he would not be tempted to pretend this was something it was not. He would marry her, provide an heir, keep his distance, and rebuild Ashford. Simple, cold, safe. The organ began. The guests shifted in their seats like hungry birds. The church doors opened and the bride entered. She walked slowly, her father's arm stiff beside her. Her dress was white satin, rich, but not foolish. Yet what caught every eye was the veil. It was not normal. It was thick, layered, heavy lace that fell all the way past her waist, like a curtain meant to hide a secret. No shadow of her face showed through, not even the shape of her nose. The whispers rose like wind. There she is. Poor thing. The Duke is brave. Alexander watched her step by step, and for the first time in years, his calm began to crack, because she did not move like a girl who wanted pity. She moved like a woman walking toward a fight she had already decided to win. When she reached the altar, she stood beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Not heavy, not sweet, just clean and sharp like winter air. He expected her to shake. She did not. He expected her to keep her head bowed. She lifted her chin. The vicar began the ceremony. Words about love and honor filled the church. Pretty lies people used to dress up reality. Alexander spoke his vows clearly, as if his voice could turn duty into something respectable. Then came her turn. Eloise Hartley spoke softly, but every word landed without fear. I will. Not trembling. Not weak. Alexander swallowed. Something about her voice made his stomach twist, like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and only now realizing how far down it went. The vicar smiled, pleased. Then he said the words every person in the church had been waiting for. You may lift the veil. A strange stillness fell. Alexander's hands rose. He told himself he did not care. He told himself he had already accepted the worst. Yet his fingers were not steady when they touched the lace. The veil felt cool and expensive, like the kind of thing meant to impress and distract. He hesitated for one heartbeat, and in that heartbeat he realized a terrifying truth. If she truly was ugly, this would be easy. If she was not, he pushed the thought away. Then he lifted. The lace rose. Light fell across her face, and the Duke of Ashford forgot how to breathe. Because the woman standing beside him was not ugly. She was so beautiful, the church seemed to blur around her. Dark hair, glossy and rich, curled in soft waves under her veil. Skin like pale cream touched with warmth, lips the color of crushed roses. But it was her eyes that struck him like a weapon. Green. Not soft green. Sharp green. The kind of green that looked like it could cut through lies. She stared back at him, calm as stone, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. And then she smiled. Not a sweet bride's smile. A knowing one, like she had set a trap and he had stepped into it perfectly. The church filled with gasps. The lady in the front pew whispered too loud, "Good heavens!" Alexander's knees went weak for half a second. He caught himself before anyone noticed, but he felt it. The loss of control, the shock that turned his blood hot. This was not what he agreed to. This was not what he prepared for. This was not safe. The vicar cleared his throat, clearly confused by the pause. "Your Grace." Alexander's mouth opened, but no words came. Eloise tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. Her smile stayed in place, quiet and cruel like a blade hidden in silk. And then she whispered so softly only he could hear. "Now you understand." His pulse slammed in his ears. "Understand what?" he forced out. "That you married me blind," she said, "and you will regret it." Alexander stared at her, heart pounding, while the church waited for him to kiss his bride. He had walked into this wedding thinking he was the one making the sacrifice. But in that moment, as Eloise Hartley looked at him like a woman who held a secret powerful enough to break him, the Duke of Ashford realized the truth. He was not the one buying. He was the one being bought, and he had no idea what she planned to take from him. The vicar spoke again, nervous now. "Your Grace, you may kiss the bride." The whole church held its breath. Alexander's mind screamed to step back, to regain control, to remember why he was here. Debt, duty, survival. But Eloise's eyes did not beg. They dared. He leaned forward like a man under a spell, and as his lips touched hers, her hand tightened on his, and he felt something pressed into his palm. A folded piece of paper. Small, hidden, deliberate. His breath stopped because only one kind of bride passed secret notes at the altar. The kind with a plan, and the kind with a lie that could ruin a duke. Alexander pulled back, his face still calm for the crowd, but his hand burning like it held fire. Eloise smiled sweetly for the church now, the perfect duchess. But her eyes told him the truth. This marriage was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of his downfall, and the secret in his hand would decide which of them survived it. Alexander kept his smile in place, as if it were stitched to his face. The guests watched him like hawks, waiting for him to stumble. He would not give them that. Not here. Not in God's house. But the folded paper in his palm felt heavier than any ring. When the vicar finally pronounced the man and wife, applause rose like a polite storm. Eloise turned slightly toward the crowd, her posture perfect, her expression calm. No one would guess she had just slipped a secret into the Duke's hand. They walked out of the church together, side by side, as if they were a love match blessed by heaven. Carriages waited outside, people threw pale flower petals. The rain had stopped, but the street still smelled wet, like a warning that had not fully passed. Alexander guided Eloise into the carriage for the wedding breakfast. The moment the door shut, the world outside went quiet. For the first time, he could look at her without the eyes of London watching. Eloise sat across from him, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her veil was gone now, and her beauty was even more dangerous in plain view. She did not look shy. She did not look pleased. She looked like someone who had already decided how this would go. Alexander's jaw tightened. "What is this?" He lifted his hand slightly, showing the folded paper without opening it. Eloise blinked slowly. "Open it." Her voice was soft, almost kind. That was what made it worse. He unfolded it with careful fingers. A few lines were written in clean, sharp ink. Your Grace, this marriage will save you from your debts, but it will not save you from me. If you try to hide me, silence me, or treat me like a purchased object, I will destroy your reputation with a truth you cannot survive. We will speak alone tonight. Eloise. Alexander read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might change. His pulse beat hard against his throat. What truth? He asked, low and controlled. Eloisea's lips curved, not in a smile, but in something close. You will find out if you behave as badly as you planned. So she knew. She knew he had expected an ugly bride. She knew he had comforted himself with that thought. He hated that she knew. He hated more that it mattered. You threatened me on our wedding day, he said. I warned you, she answered. Threats come later if you ignore it. Alexander leaned back, eyes narrowing. Who are you really? Eloise did not flinch. Your wife? That is not an answer. It is the only one you deserve at the moment. The carriage rolled over stones, and the silence grew thick. Alexander wanted to shout. He wanted to grab her wrist and force answers from her. He had learned to keep control through years of watching his father lose it. But control felt slippery now, like soap in his hands. The wedding breakfast was held at Hartley House, an enormous home in a grand square built to scream wealth, even if it could not claim old blood. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears. Plates of fine food filled the tables. Guests laughed too loudly, pretending this was romance and not trade. Eloise played her part flawlessly. She greeted ladies with calm grace. She spoke to old men with polite respect. She smiled at compliments, as if she had always belonged among them. It was almost frightening how easily she fit into the world that had called her ugly and hidden. Alexander sat beside her at the long table, his face hard, his body tense. Every few minutes he felt the urge to glance at her again, as if he might catch the trick. But she was real. Her beauty was real. Her steady confidence was real. And the note in his pocket was real. Lord Peyton, his closest friend, leaned over during the meal. You look like you swallowed a nail, he murmured. Alexander kept his eyes forward. Eat. Peyton raised an eyebrow. That bad. Quote. Alexander did not answer. Across the table, Augustus Hartley lifted his glass. To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, he announced, May their marriage be long, fruitful, and prosperous. Cheers rose. Eloise lifted her glass and drank, her eyes meeting Alexander's only once. In that glance, he felt it again. Not fear, a challenge. After the guests had eaten enough to feel satisfied and gossiped enough to feel alive, the party began to thin. Carriages carried people back to their own lives, their own secrets. Alexander stood in a quiet corridor, staring at a painting he did not see, waiting for the moment he could finally breathe. Then Hartley approached him, smiling like a man who had just bought a priceless thing. Your Grace, Hartley said, I trust you are pleased. Alexander looked at him slow and cold. You did not show me her face. Hartley smiled, did not move. A man does not show his hand in a negotiation. So it was a negotiation. Hartley shrugged gently. All marriages are. Some simply admit it. Alexander's voice sharpened. The rumors about her were those you're doing. For the first time, Hartley's eyes flickered. London enjoys its cruelty. I never corrected what people chose to believe. Alexander stepped closer. You allowed people to call your daughter a monster. Hartley's jaw set. I allowed them to underestimate her. There is a difference. A cold understanding slid into Alexander's mind. The lies had not only protected Eloise, they had protected the bargain. An ugly bride was easier to accept. A hidden bride was easier to marry without questions. Hartley lowered his voice. "My daughter is not fragile, Your Grace. She is not a girl to be handled like glass. If you try to treat her as one, you will learn what she is capable of." Alexander's mouth tightened. "Is that a warning?" Hartley smiled again. "Too smooth. A suggestion." That evening, after the last guest departed, Alexander and Eloise began their journey to Ashford Manor. The carriage was larger now, meant for a duchess. Soft cushions, warm blankets, and silence thick enough to choke. Night wrapped London in fog. Lamps glowed like small trapped moons. The city slipped away behind them. Eloise looked out the window as if she were leaving something behind, but her face showed nothing. Alexander finally spoke. "You planned that note." Eloise did not turn. "Yes, you planned my shock." "Yes." "Why?" She faced him at last, her eyes bright in the dim light. "Because you would have tried to control me otherwise. Men like you always do." Alexander's voice dropped. "You do not know me." "I know what people say," she replied. "The Duke of Ashford. Cold, proud, untouchable. A man who can turn his back on anyone, even his own heart." His fingers curled. "And what do they say about you, Duchess?" Eloise's expression softened for half a second. So small he almost missed it. Then it hardened again. "They say nothing because my father kept me hidden. And now they will watch me like a new toy. You could have refused the marriage." Eloise gave a short laugh. "Could I? My father's fortune bought your title. Your debt bought my escape. We both walked into this cage. Your Grace, the only difference is that I brought the key." Alexander stared. "Escape from what?" Her eyes flicked away. "From London, from certain men." He leaned forward slightly. "What men?" Eloise's mouth tightened. "You will learn tonight, as I wrote." Hours later, Ashford Manor rose from the darkness like a sleeping beast. The old stone walls were tall. The windows were narrow. A house built for power, not comfort. Torches burned by the entrance. Servants lined up to greet their new duchess. Eloise stepped down from the carriage with the grace of someone born to it. The staff bowed. Alexander watched their faces. Many looked shocked. Some looked confused. A few looked pleased, as if the manor itself had been waiting for a woman like her. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and old polished floors. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, greeted Eloise stiffly. "Welcome to Ashford Manor, Your Grace." Eloise's smile was calm. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I hope we will work well together." Her tone held authority without cruelty. Mrs. Henderson blinked as if she had expected arrogance or weakness, and found neither. Alexander felt something twist in his chest. He had told himself he wanted a quiet wife, but as he watched Eloise take control of the room without raising her voice, he realized a quiet wife would have made this house feel even colder. They were led to their chambers. The ducal bedchamber was vast, with high ceilings and heavy curtains. A fire burned low. The bed was so large it looked like it belonged to a king. Eloise stood near the hearth, hands clasped behind her back. Her maid began to unpack, but Eloise dismissed her with a gentle instruction. The maid left, closing the door behind her. Now they were alone. Alexander's heart thudded. Eloise faced him. "Sit," she said simply. The command surprised him. No one commanded him, but his legs moved anyway, and he hated himself for it. Eloise remained standing. In the firelight, her face looked softer, but her eyes stayed sharp. "You want the truth?" she said. "Here it is." Alexander's voice was rough. "Start!" Eloise took a breath. "There is a man in London named Lord Rookford." Alexander frowned. "A baron. He attends the clubs." "Yes," she said, "and he hunts women the way other men hunt foxes." Alexander's fingers tightened on the chair. "Explain?" Eloise's voice stayed steady, but her hands flexed once at her side, like a sign of old fear. "He saw me at a charity event 2 years ago. My father brought me out for one evening. Just one. He thought it was safe, because he would remain by my side. But men like Lord Rookford do not need time. They need only one look." Her gaze flicked to the window, as if she could still see that room. "He began sending letters, flowers, gifts. My father refused them. Then he began sending messages through other people. He cornered me once in a corridor at a house party. He told me what he wanted, not marriage, ownership." Alexander's throat went dry. "Did he touch you?" Eloise's jaw tightened. "Not that time. He tried. I got away. I told my father. My father did not believe me." Alexander felt a cold rage start to rise, slow and dangerous. And then Eloise swallowed. Then Rookford began spreading rumors. Not about my face, about my virtue. He hinted I was loose, that I wanted him, that I had asked for his attention. He was careful, always careful. He wanted my father to feel forced to accept him, to save my name. Her voice shook for the first time. "So, I made a different rumor first. I made myself ugly on paper so no man would chase me, so no one would try to claim me. I gave London a new story to tell, a cruel one, but it kept them away." Alexander stared, stunned. "You did this to protect yourself." "Yes," Eloise said, "and it worked." The invitation stopped. The men stopped. The whispers changed. My father kept me hidden and pretended it was for my sake, not his shame. I learned to live in a cage with soft walls. She looked directly at Alexander. "Then your name came to our door." His stomach turned. "You chose me." "I chose survival," she corrected. "You needed money. I needed a shield. A duke is a strong shield." Alexander's voice went low. "And the truth that could destroy me. What is it?" Quote. Eloise's face went still. "Rookford does not stop hunting. He will hear about this marriage. He will come after me again." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "That is not a truth that destroys me." Eloise leaned closer, firelight catching in her eyes. "No, but this is before the wedding. Your lawyers signed papers. My father insisted on something in the contract, a private clause." Alexander felt ice crawl up his spine. "What?" "Clause." Eloise held his gaze. "If you abandon me, if you try to send me away or keep me hidden, I can claim full control of Ashford's remaining liquid funds for my protection. It is legal. It is sealed. Your solicitor agreed, because he was desperate." Alexander's breath stopped. She had not only trapped him with her beauty, she had trapped him with law. "You," he said slowly, "came into this marriage armed." Eloise's voice softened, but it did not weaken. "I came into it prepared because I have learned what happens to women who are not." Alexander rose from his chair, anger and shock crashing together. "You would ruin me!" Eloise shook her head. "No, I would save myself. There is a difference." He paced once, then turned back to her, breathing hard. "You think I would discard you?" Eloise's eyes held something like pain. "You married me without meeting me. You believed I was ugly and still accepted. That tells me you wanted a wife you could ignore." Her words landed like a punch because they were true. Alexander's voice dropped. You are in my house now. Eloise lifted her chin. And you are in my trap now. We are both stuck. Question is, what kind of stuck will we be? For a moment, they stared at each other in the firelight. Two proud people cornered by their own choices. Then a knock sounded at the door. A footman entered pale. Your Grace, he said to Alexander, voice shaking. A messenger arrived from London. It is urgent. He handed Alexander a sealed letter. Alexander broke it open. His eyes scanned the words and his face turned hard as stone. Eloise watched him. What is it? Quote. Alexander's voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly weight. Lord Rookford has left London. Eloise's blood went cold. Where is he going? Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes at last. Was something she had not seen before. Pure, focused fury. He is coming here. Alexander read the letter once, then folded it with careful hands. Lord Rookford was riding to Ashford Manor before night. Eloise went pale, but she did not look away. He will come smiling, she said. Then he will try to get me alone. Alexander answered. He will not. He set the house in motion. The gates were locked. The watch was doubled. A rider went to the magistrate, another to Lord Peyton. Servants were warned to admit no guest without the Duke's word. The manor grew quiet, like a fist closing. At dusk, a carriage rolled up the drive. Rookford stepped out with a grin, dressed like a man arriving at a ball. Ashford, he called. I came to check on your bride. His eyes found Eloise at once, standing inside the open doors, her back straight. Alexander met him on the steps. You are not welcome, he said. Rookford laughed softly. Do you fear a friendly visit? Alexander's voice stayed flat. I refuse you. Rookford tried to look past him. Duchess, he said, smooth as oil. London misses you. Tell your husband you deserve better. Eloise did not speak. Alexander moved between them. You will not speak to her, he said. You will not look at her. For a heartbeat, the charm slipped. You do not know her, Rookford hissed. She lies. Alexander turned slightly so the servants could hear. I know enough, he said. You chased her, threatened her, and tried to ruin her name when she would not bend. That ends today. The yard went silent. Rookford's face tightened. Men hate wives who make trouble. He snapped. Alexander's eyes were cold. Only weak men do. Rookford stepped forward, aiming for the doors. Alexander lifted one hand. The guards blocked him at once. Leave, Alexander said. If you return, you will be arrested. If you write to my wife, I will take your letters to the magistrate. If you speak her name again, I will answer you where everyone can hear. Rookford looked around and saw the change. No one smiled for him now. He backed away, cursed, and climbed into his carriage. The gates shut behind him. Eloise's knees shook after the danger passed. She pressed a hand to the wall, breathing hard. Alexander reached her in 2 steps. Are you hurt? He asked. She shook her head and tears finally fell. I thought I would always be alone against him, she whispered. You are not alone, Alexander said. Not if you will have me. That night, the fire burned low in the ducal chamber. Alexander stopped a few feet from her. I married you for duty, he said, and I expected to feel nothing. I feared your beauty because it made me want you, and wanting you made me afraid. I hid behind pride. He swallowed. I am done hiding. Eloise lifted her eyes. I hid behind an ugly story to survive, she said. I never meant to trap you. Alexander shook his head. You did not trap me, he said. You woke me. He knelt. Not for the crowd, but for her. Stay, he said. Not as my bargain, as my wife, as my equal. Eloise reached down and pulled him up. Then stand with me, she said. He did. He kissed her like a vow. She rested her forehead to his and whispered, "No more secrets." He whispered, "No more fear." He held her, and the old fear in her bones began to loosen. Inside Ashford Manor, the veil was gone, and for the first time, the marriage felt like a choice.